At 56, I decided to give everything to my wife during our divorce. My lawyer begged me to stop, but I signed the papers with a smile. No one knew I had already won the case before her lawyer even read the document. My name is Richard Hartman. Everyone calls me Rick. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant, the last 14 of them running fraud examinations for a firm out of Dayton, Ohio, before I retired to run the company my father built. That company was called Hartman Precision Tool and Die. My father, Walter Hartman, started it in 1968 with a single lathe machine in a rented garage on 5th Street. By the time he handed it to me, it employed 62 people and supplied precision parts to 3 aerospace contractors. It was not just a business. It was the only thing my father ever left behind that meant something. 11 months before I signed those papers, I buried my mother. 6 months after that, I found out my wife of 22 years, Renee, was sleeping with a man named Marcus Doyle, a logistics consultant she had brought on to modernize our supply chain. I was tired. I was grieving. I was, by every measure, exactly the kind of man people like Renee and Marcus look for, distracted, heartbroken, and too proud to ask for help. That is what they were counting on. What they did not know is that distraction was the one disguise I was best at wearing. The first thing I noticed was small. It usually is. Renee had always kept the household filing cabinet perfectly organized. She used to joke that she inherited that habit from me. One evening in March, I went looking for our property tax statement and found the folder for Doyle Industrial Solutions tucked behind our home insurance file. I had never heard the name. When I asked Renee about it at dinner, she said it was just a vendor Marcus set up for parts sourcing and changed the subject to my cousin's wedding. I said nothing else. But that night, I logged into the company's accounting software from my old laptop, the one still registered under my administrative credentials from when I ran the books myself. Over the following 6 weeks, I built what I would have called in my old career a paper trail. Doyle Industrial Solutions had been paid 4 separate invoices in the past year, totaling $187,400, for expedited freight consulting, a service our company had never used before Marcus arrived and never needed after. I pulled the bank routing information attached to those payments. It traced to a business account at Third Merchant Bank in Columbus, opened only 14 months earlier. The listed owner was Marcus Doyle. The listed co-signer was Renee Hartman. My wife's name was on a shell company that had billed my father's business nearly $200,000 for services that did not exist. I sat with that for 2 full days before I did anything else. I went back through 18 months of general ledger entries, the way I used to do for clients who suspected their own controllers were skimming. What I found wasn't just the 4 Doyle invoices. There were smaller transactions too, a $6,200 consulting retainer, paid monthly starting the same week Marcus was hired. A company credit card statement showing a 4-night stay at a resort in Sarasota billed under trade show travel, even though our trade show that year had been in Cleveland. And a vendor account for Meridian Logistics that used the same PO. Box in Columbus as Doyle Industrial Solutions. Whoever set this up wasn't careless. They were confident. Confident people leave patterns because they stop checking their own work. I did not confront her. Not yet. In this line of work, confronting someone before your evidence is airtight is the fastest way to watch it disappear. So I called the one person I trusted more than almost anyone left in my life, Frank Delgado, my old partner from 3 fraud cases we worked together in the early 2000s. A retired FBI financial crimes agent living outside Cincinnati. Frank had a rule he'd repeated to me for 20 years. The people who get caught are the ones who panic and confront. The people who win are the ones who wait and document. He drove up that weekend, looked over everything I'd gathered spread across my kitchen table, and said, "Rick, this isn't just an affair. This is embezzlement, and it's dressed up as a marriage." He told me to act completely normal, keep going to Sunday dinners, keep pretending, let them believe they were winning, so I did. Frank didn't just tell me to wait, he gave me a system. Every Sunday night, after Renee had gone to bed, I would sit in my father's old office chair in the back room of the plant and update a single spreadsheet. Date, transaction, amount, source document. corroborating evidence. Frank called it the boring file, because he said the cases that hold up in court are never the dramatic ones, they're the boring ones, the ones where every single line has a receipt behind it. He also warned me about a specific danger. The moment she senses you know, she'll move the money somewhere you can't trace. Or she'll rush the settlement through before your lawyer finishes his review. You have to look slower than you are, so I did the opposite of what I felt. I asked Marcus, at a company barbecue in May, how the supply chain modernization was going, and I watched him answer with total ease, the way people do when they think no one is actually listening. I approved 2 more Doyle Industrial Solutions invoices myself that month, $22,000 combined, specifically so the pattern would keep generating evidence instead of going quiet. Frank called that feeding the file. It felt like standing still while a house burned slowly around me and pretending I couldn't smell the smoke. For the next 4 months, I sat across from Renee at our kitchen table, ate the dinners she cooked, went to my niece's graduation with her arm looped through mine, and said nothing. It was, without question, the hardest performance of my life. There was one night in June I will never forget. We were at a restaurant downtown for our anniversary, 22 years, and Renee reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you, Rick." I smiled and told her I felt the same. Under the table, my other hand was resting on my phone, where 3 days earlier I had received a forwarded email from a source inside Third Merchant Bank that Frank had quietly connected me with, showing a text exchange between Renee and Marcus that Frank had legally obtained during a parallel review. In it, Renee had written, "Once the divorce is filed, the house and the company split are automatic. He won't fight it, he never fights anything. We just need 6 more months before he notices the Doyle account." Marcus had replied, "He's a numbers guy, Renee. If he ever actually looks, we're finished." She wrote back, "He's not looking. He's grieving his mother, trust me." I trusted the numbers, I always had. There was another moment in late July that nearly broke the whole operation. Renee asked me, out of nowhere over Sunday coffee, whether I'd been going through the old accounting files lately. My laptop's login history must have shown up somewhere she could see it. I remember setting my mug down very carefully and saying, "No, why is something wrong with the books?" She said no, she was just curious. She'd heard the accountant mention an old audit trail. I told her I hadn't touched that system in years, ever since I handed the day-to-day over to the new controller. She believed me, or at least she wanted to. Frank, when I called him that night, told me it was the closest call we'd have. "That's the moment most people panic and confess," he said. "You didn't. That's why this is going to work." By August, Frank and I had assembled a complete forensic file: the fraudulent invoices, the shell company registration, the bank records showing $187,400 diverted from Hartman Precision Tool, and die into an account jointly held by my wife and the man she was sleeping with, and text messages proving intent. There was only one problem left to solve, and it wasn't a legal one, it was a practical one. Renee had already filed for divorce in July, publicly claiming irreconcilable differences, and was pushing hard for a fast, amicable settlement. 50% of the company, 50% of the house, 50% of everything. Her lawyer, a sharp young associate named Colleen Pratt, kept sending settlement drafts stamped, time-sensitive, clearly hoping to close the deal before anyone dug deeper. My own lawyer, a good, cautious man named Edward Nakamura, told me flatly, "Rick, do not sign anything until we finish the asset audit. You are walking away from half of everything your father built, and you don't even seem angry about it." That worries me more than anything. What Edward didn't know, what nobody but Frank knew, was that I had already spent 3 weeks quietly restructuring. Under Ohio law, and under the terms of the prenuptial agreement Renee and I signed in 1998. Any asset dissipation or fraud committed against marital property during the marriage voids that spouses claim to the corresponding value, provided it's proven with documented evidence before final judgment. I had that evidence. I also had something else. 2 months earlier, using my authority as sole owner of record, I had moved the company's actual equity, the real value, the patents, the aerospace contracts, the machinery, into an irrevocable trust set up for our 2 adult children, Emily and Nathan, dated and notarized, entirely legal. Entirely within my rights as majority owner before any settlement was finalized. What remained in Hartman Precision Tool and Die, as a standalone operating entity, the one named explicitly in the divorce filing, was now a shell carrying $340,000 in equipment lease debt and almost no equity. On paper, it looked like the whole business. In reality, it was scaffolding. So when Colleen Pratt sent over the final settlement, 50% of the house, and full transfer of all right, title, and interest in Hartman Precision Tool and Die to Renee, in exchange for her waiving spousal support, I told Edward I wanted to sign it. He nearly stood up out of his chair. "Rick, listen to me. You are giving her the company, your father's company. I am begging you not to do this until we finish the audit." I looked at him and said, "Edward, I need you to trust me the way I trusted my instincts for 31 years. File the fraud disclosure and the trust documentation the same week we sign, not before, the same week." He didn't understand it, but he did it. In the 2 weeks before the signing, I did one more thing Frank advised, something that had nothing to do with paperwork. I took Nathan and Emily out to dinner, separately, without explaining the full situation, and simply told them that whatever they heard about the divorce in the coming months, they should trust that I had a plan, and that the company, their grandfather's company, was going to be fine. Nathan, who has his grandfather's bluntness, asked me directly, "Are you just giving up, Dad?" I told him no. "I'm just not fighting where she thinks the fight is." He didn't fully understand what I meant. Neither did Emily. I didn't want them carrying that weight before they had to. We scheduled the signing for a Thursday afternoon in September at Colleen Pratt's office downtown. Renee wore a soft gray blazer and sat with her hands folded, trying very hard to look like a woman who had not been planning this for over a year. Marcus wasn't there, of course. He never was publicly. When Colleen slid the settlement folder across the table, Renee looked at me with something close to disbelief, like she still couldn't quite trust that it was this easy. "You're really not going to fight this," she said quietly, almost gently, like she felt sorry for me. "No," I said. "I'm not going to fight it." I picked up the pen, and I signed every page with a smile, the same smile I used to give clients right before I told them we'd found the fraud. I remember Renee actually reached over and squeezed my hand afterward and said, "Thank you for making this easy, Rick. I know this isn't who you are." I told her, "You're right." "It isn't." She didn't catch the second meaning, neither did Colleen. What Renee did not know, walking out of that office already texting Marcus that it was done. He signed everything, was that Edward had filed our fraud disclosure and the irrevocable trust documentation with the court that same afternoon. Timestamped 4 hours after the settlement was executed. Under the terms of our prenup's dissipation clause, once fraud against marital assets is documented, any transfer of company ownership executed after the date the fraud began is subject to clawback, meaning the everything Renee had just been handed was not the company. It was the debt-carrying shell that used to wear the company's name. The real business, the contracts, the equipment, the 62 jobs my father built, had already legally belonged to a trust for my children for 6 weeks before she ever sat down at that table. It took her 17 days to find out. She called our accountant, wanting to access the aerospace contract renewals, and was told those contracts had been reassigned to a new corporate entity, Hartman Legacy Manufacturing, wholly owned by the Hartman Family Trust. She called the bank about the equipment line of credit and was informed the collateral had been transferred out months earlier, leaving behind $340,000 in unsecured lease obligations, now legally hers to service. And somewhere in that phone call, or the one after it, or the one after that, someone finally handed her the full settlement folder to actually read past the summary page, the fraud disclosure attached as Exhibit C, the bank records as Exhibit D, the text messages as Exhibit E, and she read the fine print. She called me that night. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was 11 minutes long. It moved through every stage I'd watched 100 fraud subjects move through in my career: confusion, then anger, then a strange, wounded kind of pleading. "You knew," she said. "You knew this whole time, and you just let me sign it. How could you do that to me?" And then, near the end, the line every one of them eventually says, the one that always sounds different in the moment than it does replayed later. We were desperate. Rick, Marcus and I, we didn't think you'd ever actually look. That was the mistake, not the affair, not even the money. The mistake was believing that grief made me blind, instead of understanding that grief was the one thing I actually knew how to work through with my eyes open. The consequences unfolded slowly, the way real consequences do, not in a single dramatic scene, but in a series of quiet, procedural blows. Marcus Doyle was indicted the following spring on wire fraud and conspiracy charges tied to the shell company. The federal case leaned heavily on the exact bank records and text messages Frank and I had assembled that summer, and Marcus eventually pled to a reduced charge, serving 14 months at a minimum security facility outside Columbus. His consulting license, such as it was, never recovered. Renee was never criminally charged. The prenup's dissipation and clawback clause handled the financial reckoning civilly instead, through the family court that had approved our original settlement. And I chose not to push for anything beyond that, partly for our children's sake, and partly because by the time the paperwork settled, I had already gotten what actually mattered. She kept Hartman Precision Tool and Die in name only, along with its $340,000 in unsecured lease obligations, and spent the better part of a year negotiating those debts down with creditors instead of running a company. She sold the house 11 months later to cover what was left of the shortfall, moving into a rental across town. I heard secondhand through a mutual friend that she told people the divorce had cost her everything. In a narrow, literal sense, that was finally true. My son Nathan didn't speak to her for almost 2 years. My daughter Emily eventually rebuilt a careful, guarded relationship with her mother. They have dinner every few months now, and Emily has never asked me to attend, which I understand and don't resent. I never asked either of my children to choose sides, though I know some choosing happened anyway, the way it always does when a family breaks in public. Hartman Legacy Manufacturing is still running today, still in Dayton, still employing most of the same 62 families it did the year my father died. Nathan runs operations now, and he's better at it than I ever was. He has his grandfather's patience with machines, and none of my old habit of assuming the numbers alone will tell you everything. Emily handles the contracts I used to handle myself, including the same aerospace renewals Renee tried and failed to access that October. I go in twice a week, mostly to have coffee with the men and women on the floor who remember when my father wore the same pair of work boots into that shop for 11 straight years, because he refused to buy a second, until the company turned a profit. Frank still calls me every few months, usually just to ask how the kids are doing, sometimes to remind me, half joking, that I owe him a fishing trip for that summer. I think about that summer more than I let on. Not the affair, not even the money. I think about how strange it was to sit at my own anniversary dinner holding my wife's hand while I already knew, down to the dollar, exactly how the story was going to end. There's a particular kind of discipline that job teaches you, the discipline of not reacting to what you know until the moment it's useful. I didn't expect to ever need it in my own marriage. People ask me sometimes if I regret signing that settlement with a smile, if it was cruel, if I enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy it. I don't think revenge is a thing you're supposed to enjoy. I think it's just a debt that finally gets paid in the currency the other person understands. Renee understood paperwork, so I paid her in paperwork. If there's anything I'd want someone in my position to take from this, it's simple. The smartest thing you can do when you've been betrayed is not to raise your voice. It's to lower it and start counting. Blood may be thicker than water, but it has never once been thicker than evidence. And the quietest people in the room are usually the ones who already know how it ends. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay with this channel. There are more stories like this one coming every week. Thank you for watching.